But what that will cause is a cost of living crisis for ordinary people, just like it did after 2008.
There are some low-hanging fruit which should obviously be done. You should equate capital gains with income tax. There's no reason
people
why.
who actually do the work, who are productive and create the productivity in society, we tax a thing that we want them to be doing.
Listen,
right?
is it levelling up if I give a poor person £2.80 and I give a rich person £250? You know, so
Redistributing wealth never made anybody richer, and there was like, yeah, well, did the people with the money tell you? Don't know if anyone here is a big fan of Gary Stevenson, but I'm pretty hot on Gary Stevenson. As far as millionaire traders go, I'm a big fan. He's a good dude. I think he's got some really interesting points to make. It's this him on LBC talking about the fact that it's fine that we printed a bunch of money during the pandemic. It was government debt created out of money printing, and we don't need to pay it back, right? And like, this is the idea that there is some kind of COVID debt to repay is untrue. But what he does do is talk about the fact that the money was going to rich people, and that's what's caused the cost of living crisis. And he predicted the cost of living crisis 2 years ago, and he even uses that turn of phrase. Let's have a listen.
I think if you remember, after 2008, 2010, 2011, we did have quite high inflation, 5%, coming up to 6%.
That's right.
And then the Bank of England, rather sensibly, I suspect, decided to leave the money out there, not take any money back, leave the easy money to the Bank of England. If that happens, if it's 5-6%, which, I don't want to make any exact predictions, but it could be at some point coming out of this, I think the Bank of England will allow it to continue. But what that will cause is a cost of living crisis for ordinary people, just like it did after 2008.
Gary, you've been...
It's 2 years. He knew already, right? If you let the rich people have all the money, it makes life worse for everybody else. He fucking Nostradamus over here. Literally called it a cost of living crisis. Right? He predicted all of this shit. He did a really good piece on Politics Live, which we're going to react to now.
Well, let's turn our attention to wealth. You heard in the headlines, King Charles, multi-millionaire, has asked for a surge in profits from the Crown estate in offshore wind farms to be used for what he called the wider public good. So it would mean that some money set aside for the sovereign grant. You can see here the headline.
See, even the fucking king has taken the communism pill. Right, the public good. He believes he's taken a modern day Marx right there. I believe in him. Let's do it. If he uses the sovereign power to dissolve capitalism, let's fucking go.
In the Times, King's Crown Estate wind farm to generate £1 billion for Britain. It would be set aside normally for the sovereign grant, which runs the royal household. But in this case, he's suggesting it be retained by the Treasury and can be used for public spending. So should the rest of the rich be doing something similar? What do you make of the King's decision and announcement today? A good?
Oh, it's very generous of him. I wish I had £1 billion I could donate away and be able to afford.
Actually, Frances Coppola was talking about it in her blog, which is actually another thing that's really worth reading too, in that a load of what hampers our climate policy is that the central bank is, when they're using quantitative easing, is that they're buying bonds in the fossil fuel industries. So we have a central bank that isn't taking proper precautions to be able to buy bonds in industries that are pro-climate, and they're continuing to essentially prop up a really bad industry by buying the wrong bonds. When what we should really be doing is having our central bank invest specifically in new bonds with regards to the green energy sector. That was a really interesting article. Another thing definitely worth reading. Frances Coppola, good economist. She talks a lot about how we can use quantitative easing essentially as kind of de facto equalizer of the economy, right? If you give poor people enough money, sure, you may cause inflation, right? But as long as it stays within the realm of poor people, right? If the money supply gets bigger, but only one side is getting the injection of the extra money supply, that means that the relative levels of inequality goes down. Obviously, what we've had at the moment from the pandemic is the opposite. Where we had quantitative easing, we increased the money supply, but it all went to the rich. They pumped it into assets and increased asset prices. I am also skeptical of central banks too, Zero Day Buddha. Like most institutions, for example, like governments, for example, if you put them into the wrong hands, they have the ability to do bad things. And they are doing bad things. In the UK especially, the central bank is increasing interest rates when we don't even have demand pull inflation, and I have no idea why.
But it's not enough. It's not enough. In the last 3 years, the government's given out £700 billion. That would be enough to give £14,000 to every single adult in the country. Now, if you're going to give up that amount of money, you need to do an analysis of where that money's going to end up. You have to. And at the beginning of COVID, I was screaming out, let's do an analysis of who's going to end up with the £700 billion. The Conservatives didn't do it, Labour didn't do it, the BBC didn't do it. So I did it, and what I found out was that money was going to overwhelmingly end up with the richest people in society. That's enough money to give the richest 5 million adults in this country £140,000 each.
Now, you were a millionaire. You earned £1 million in your first 2 years, you say, as a trader. You've changed your mind about how the world, how capitalism should work in the UK. What sort of triggered your Damascene conversion?
The way I became a millionaire is after the 2008 crisis.
And you're absolutely right, Jim Speak, and that's the thing, right? When you have the power of the central bank and you can do quantitative easing, you can literally just give nurses a pay rise, right? Everyone's saying, oh, we've got to tax more people, got to tax the rich to pay for nurses. We have a central bank. Just give the people the money. Just make with the money now. You can do that.
I realised that because of a massive growth in inequality, we would basically never come out of that crisis. And I started to put massive bets on that the economy would get worse and worse and worse. And within a year of doing that, I became Citibank's most profitable trader in the world. So, you know, if your job is to look at the economy and analyse it, and your analysis is the economy is going to get worse and worse because of inequality, and then you're judged to be the best trader in the world, I think you have a responsibility to do something about it.
Cynics would say that's after you earned all that money. That's
well, I
when
was
you saw the
24,
light.
you know, you have to give me a bit of time.
This is, let's not forget.
And also, there's a difference between betting against the synthetic success of the market and being the person who crashed the market. To try and say that he's some kind of hypocrite for, you know, trading based upon the predictions of where the economy was going, as if that's somehow similar to the people who actually made the economy worse.
Money that has been taxed on acquisition, that you are then looking at taxing further.
Well, what are the policies, Gary? What would you do?
Lots of things are difficult, but some things are important, OK? If you give out £700 billion, you need to know where that money's gone to. OK, if you're giving hundreds of thousands of pounds to the richest people in the country, you have to expect inflation, a cost of living crisis for ordinary people. Listen, we increased inequality.
Oh, yeah, she's from the Institute of Economic Affairs. So just like Emily Carver, her opinions are bought and paid for. Right? She is a propagandist. She is not anybody who has pure intentions.
At the fastest rate in the history of this country, during a time when the economy was closed, you are making ordinary families poorer. That is the cause of this crisis.
But you're
don't fix it.
Just to explain, you're talking about hundreds of billions of pounds being handed out during the pandemic, in part. So during the furlough scheme, the argument from the government, and I'll let Nikki and Angela in a moment, was that it kept people's jobs. It paid people's wages. What were they to do instead?
You do the analysis of where the money will end up. Listen, I was there. I'm an inequality economist. I wanted to know where does it end up. OK, the money goes to furloughed workers. It's £14,000 per adult. Do you think furloughed workers are £14,000 richer? They're not, because they weren't getting their wages. OK, well, who's got the wages? The corporations. Well, were the corporations richer?
Exactly. He doesn't run the economy. He just knows how it works.
In general, not because they were closed. Who's got the money? The customers. But not all customers, because it was only luxury, non-essential spending that stopped during COVID.
Nikki, do you want to defend furlough and the decisions made by the government during that time? Of course, there are lots of allegations about billions being wasted.
I think an issue as well is people always thought that the additional quantitative easing would naturally lead to inflation due to increasing the money supply, when actually the productive capacity of the economy didn't slow. The reason why we got hyperinflation, for example, like New Zimbabwe or Weimar Germany, is first of all they had huge amounts of money in foreign currency, whereas we're a sovereign currency issuer, so that's not an issue. Most of our bonds are internal rather than owned by other states, for example. And second, as well, is that there was incredibly low productivity in Weimar Germany and Zimbabwe, whereas we have maintained our continued productive capacity, but we just shut the economy off for a short period of time whilst we were making sure people weren't going to die of COVID. BBC seems to keep inviting the IEA people on all the time. So often, it's excruciating how often we get the IEA, we get the Economist, we get the CBI, all the time, policy exchange. I'm just sick of think tank people ever getting any position in the media and continue being treated as if they've got some genuine opinions rather than just being paid propagandists for the capitalists who pay their bills.
To be clear, I'm not against furlough. What I'm against is not analysing where the money ended up and not doing anything about it accumulating with the richest people.
Well, they would say there wasn't enough time to do it. But Nikki...
I mean, you're absolutely right, Sarah Day, but it is intentionally obscure. But it's intentionally obscure in such a way as to make people think the things that are not in their benefit through manufactured consent, right? And it's why the think tanks exist. They exist to put out so much content into the public conscience that explicitly works to make people not think in their own interests, but to think in the interest of billionaires, right? Yeah, exactly. It's propaganda. They put out so much of it that people just naturally assume the stuff that's being said by the think tanks, right? You've all seen the meme where it was someone who said, like, you know, redistributing wealth never made anybody richer. And there was like, yeah, did the people with the money tell you that? And that's literally what's happening in the media today. There's a really great video by Tom Nicholas talking about how there was basically a media storm after the Adam Smith Institute released a paper speculating about what would happen if we privatized the moon, and then loads of newspapers just ran the story. And I'm like, who cares? It's a nonsense paper from a shitty think tank. Why are we turning this into a news story? It's nothing. Ignore them. But they don't get ignored because they occupy so much of the media space already. It costs capital a lot less in propaganda budget than they would otherwise rightfully be paying in taxes. 100%. Or how much they would lose if they had to properly bargain collectively or sectorally with a unionised workforce, right? They would lose far more. They make far more money spending a bunch of money propagandising working people into not joining a union than they would ever spend if people were actually unionised.
There is an increase in the wealthy paying more tax to
Taxpayers are not the... I pay tax.
I pay tax.
Yeah, exactly.
Also, the point that Conservative MP just made there, saying, "Oh well, the rich people pay the highest proportion of the tax in this country." Yeah, they pay the highest proportion of cash in this tax in this country because our country is very unequal, right? If you have a country which is full of which has got 20 rich people and 40 poor people, right, and the 20 people all and the taxation is done over a certain threshold where way below that is the poverty line, right? And you'll say, oh, well, only 20 of us are paying tax at this point. You 40 people are scrounging off of us when, the people at the bottom literally cannot afford to live, right? Whereas if you made a more equal society, if you flattened the amount people paid and made it far less extreme at both ends of the income spectrum, the amount of tax people would be paying would be far less extreme, would be far less concentrated in the wealth at the top. That's what that percentage is telling you. And for them, and again, the fact we have literal MPs in the House of Commons who do not know how maths works, right? Maybe Rishi Sunak was right. We do need to be taught maths just in case we all become MPs and we forget how percentages work. This is income tax, though, right? I think it's all taxes in general, because she's talking about the top 10%. And you've got to remember, the top 10% includes people earning like 60k or over, for example, right? Remember when Corbyn wanted to tax the 5% of income earners? That threshold was £80,000. That is how stacked our economy is. In the 90% of the public, 95% of the public earn £80,000 or less, or at least they did in 2019, for example. Obviously, that's changed with inflation and changed with differences in the increase in inequality during the pandemic, for example. Right? That's how unequal our society. The top 5%, like that's where the 5% starts, is at £80,000. It's crazy. And the issue is, as you're absolutely right, though, Jim, speaking, the income tax is stratified in this way. But as Gary is about to point out later in this clip, rich people don't pay enough tax as it is, even though they pay a huge proportion because our country is unequal. The actual richest of the richest, the 0.01%ers, rather than the 5%ers or the 10%ers, they don't actually pay any tax or pay very many tax, or pay as much tax as you or I would, because their tax is paid on dividends, it's paid upon capital gains, it's paid upon, selling stocks and shares, right? It's not paid in the same that we would pay income tax, because dividend payouts and capital gains are taxed far less. It makes no sense in that the people who actually do the work, who are productive and create the productivity in society, we tax the thing that we want them to be doing, right? The way tax is supposed to work is that you're supposed to tax higher the things that you don't want people to do. Living off of dividend income or living off capital gains income is not productive. We have a productivity problem in this country. And if we have a productivity problem, we need to increase productivity. So taking the most productive members of society, which are the people who work for a wage, and taxing them out of existence... Thank you, Belvar P, for the bits. Much appreciated. I've lost my train of thought now. Yeah, if you tax something, it disincentivizes it, yet we're now taxing the most the people who are the most productive, right? If you want to make this country more productive, cut the tax that is paid by working people and massively put much more tax on people who make their money from capital gains, who make their money from dividend payouts, right? That's the fairer way of doing things. And a better way of doing it, if you want to encourage productivity. In a sense, I'm going to say this again, Liz Truss was sort of correct, but unfortunately she then wanted to cut a bunch of other taxes from things like duty on alcohol, which made no fucking sense. But their kind of headline thing of cutting income tax rates, I don't necessarily disagree with. I just disagreed with the way that they did it. And they should have also increased taxes elsewhere rather than just decreasing taxes everywhere, because they believe in low tax rather than believing in supply side economics that they're trying to tell us they believe in. They didn't actually. Whilst they believe in low taxes, they don't know how to introduce a low tax program to create growth. I mean, it is the incompetence. Incompetence is the excuse from Liz Truss, because Liz Truss genuinely believes in this free market supply side economics nonsense, right? She genuinely believes that stuff. But the people who are pulling her strings at the IEA and at Policy Exchange, right? These are the people who are ideological, who are not incompetent. These people are incredibly, vindictive in the way that they do things, and they just wanted tax breaks for their funders, and that's why they pushed for the silly tax cut plan that Liz Truss were actually instituted, rather than a progressive tax plan of a progressive plan of tax cuts that should have been implemented by taking more people at the bottom of the income scale out of the tax bracket, increasing the first threshold rather than getting rid of the higher threshold. That would have been the tax cut that we should have been doing, not a tax cut that favoured the wealthy. Liz Truss was originally a Liberal Democrat who then moved to the Conservative Party and essentially sold her soul to the think tanks to try and essentially boost her own career. For a night out with mid-90s Liz Truss would have been quite fun. Yeah, 100%. I absolutely agree. Because now what we literally have the worst of both worlds, where not only are the tax brackets staying the same under Rishi Sunak and Jeremy Hunt, they're also freezing the tax brackets so they don't rise with inflation. So people who do the work, who create the wealth of our civilization and are productive, are now being taxed even more. And we're not taxing the rich. In fact, Rishi Sunak and Jeremy Hunt gave loopholes to the mega rich, say for example the energy giants. When they were creating the windfall tax on the energy companies, they left them the reinvestment clause on the windfall tax. So a bunch of these massive energy giants got away from paying taxes whilst they were raking in mega profits because of the energy crisis. And now working people who we need to be able to get our productivity growth going are getting taxed out of the arsehole. Everyone who runs this country is a fucking idiot, and I should be in charge.
Working people pay tax. The wealthiest people don't pay tax. They pay much, much lower rates of tax.
Right, and why is that? Is that because they can afford to move their money elsewhere? Is it because they can afford to leave the country?
You know what? I might question it's partially because we have a Prime Minister whose father-in-law is one of the richest men in the world. We have a previous Prime Minister who went on to make millions of pounds as soon as he left office. David Cameron made £10 million in a year of leaving office. If you put tax decisions in the hands of people who are extremely rich or about to become extremely rich, do you think they will say, let's tax extremely rich people?
All right, Nikki?
I think that's such a cheap shot. Keep throwing at the Prime Minister. He comes from the background.
And this is again it's typical this liberal mind rot here. Going, I understand that this person's material interests are in protecting themselves and protecting their rich friends at the donor classes, but unfortunately, I don't believe that people are influenced by their material interests. I believe that everyone is just entirely saintly, moving through the world incredibly altruistically. And anyone who declares that material interests are going to shape people's decisions, it's just jealous. It's just having cheap shots. And it's obvious, right? I think that Gary is secretly a Marxist and he won't tell anybody. He was talking like in very vague Leninist terms in the Aaron Bastani interview, to be fair.
And he comes from, he's worked hard, like you, in the city, and, he's made his contribution.
And he's presided over the biggest increase in inequality in the history of the country.
And you're absolutely right, Zeri Debodo. They said that they live in a socioeconomic bubble. And Gary Stevenson made this point in the Aaron Bastani interview, in that economists live in this world of they live in this world of hypotheticals, right? They look at numbers on a screen and then try and make predictions from that. And he made the point, if you actually want to learn economics, go out on the street, ask your friends' mums, what's their economic position? Look out in the central business district of your current city, right? What do the shops look like? Are shops closing down? Is it busy, right? Look at the real world, live in the real world, and you'll understand economics much better than you will reading a textbook, looking at econometrics, or trying to surmise, make guesses based upon whether the numbers or the red line is going up or down.
I'm a low-tax, small-state Conservative, and I want to see tax cuts. And you know, and I
They're
know,
not coming, are they?
Well, let's see what's happened. Let's see what happens in the budget. Let's see what happens in the next budget.
No.
We've got to move move our growth agenda on, of course, but we've also got to ensure that we pay for COVID, we pay for the cost of living, and we ensure that we pay for the war that's in Ukraine.
What do you say to James Dyson? I mean, he is a wealth creator, he would say, and he doesn't want regulation and high taxes in order to create jobs. And
Well, to be fair, she did preface it by saying that Mr. Dyson would say that he is indeed a wealth creator, rather than a wealth extractor, which is what I call him.
pay those people.
Well, I've never met James Dyson. He might be a very nice
I
guy,
haven't
but
either.
he's a very wealthy person, and he doesn't want tax on the very wealthy. I don't think I need to say more than that. But what I'm saying is, what I'm seeing in this discussion is a government that's given out £700 billion and has done no analysis of where the
Well,
money's
you've
gone.
said that, but that's
No,
the kind
you don't even know who's got the money now.
But you left your job in the city trading in 2014. More broadly speaking, what is the answer? What are the policies that either Labour or Conservatives could do that would actually bring back some of the wealth from the super rich, if we're going to call them that, and redistribute it?
There are some low-hanging fruit which should obviously be done. You should equate capital gains with income tax. There's no reason why the wealthy pay less on that rate. You should close the loopholes, obviously. But you need to bring in something that will transfer that wealth back. If you're willing to give £700 billion to the richest and do nothing to bring it back, then ordinary families pay the price. So you need to bring in serious moves to redistribute.
You've also got to deal with offshore tax evasions. You've got to deal with these packages of offshore companies that allow people to export their money and avoid paying taxes. You've got to deal with profit shifting in global multinational corporations. Some of this has got to be done by international agreement. But the fact is, as Thomas...
I must say, I really agree with Angela Eagle here. But imagine what happened if she became like a front bencher or something. I don't think she'd be very imposing in Prime Minister's questions or anything. Yeah, her voice really isn't. It's not great, is it? But then my voice isn't great either. So I'm not really I'm in a bit of a glass house at the moment.
Thomas Piketty, the economist, says we're now in a situation where the wealthy are going to get more and more wealthy, and wealth is actually going to
like rich person wants to continue being rich. Shocker.
accumulate without stopping because growth levels are lower than the amount of money you can get on your wealth in interest. So what's happening is that the billionaires index, the Bloomberg billionaires index, has to be updated every day.
Well, I mean, Annabelle, isn't it...
global billionaires' wealth is rising so much it's obscene, and we need to, as a global international community of politicians and economists, do something about it.
Right, well, hang on. Let me...
If the lives of the poorest are being improved, continually improved, then even if the super rich are getting richer, you're still seeing improvements in the quality of life of the poorest.
But that's not happening. We're seeing a drop in living standards. Wages have been stagnant for a decade, right? Clearly, the neoliberal order of quote unquote trickle down economics, for example, their supply side economic reforms, their kneecapping of the labor movement, for example. This hasn't worked. It's not brought the prosperity. All it's done is put huge amounts of wealth in the pockets of rich people at the expense of everybody else. Because unfortunately, that's how the economy works. You cannot lift, the rising tide will not lift all boats, right? Money is not value in as of itself. It is a representative, or it represents specifically the distribution that we have of assets and goods and services and wealth in our society, right? If rich people get 100 billion, and poor people get 10,000, the poor people are worse off. It's a competitive resource.
Society.
Is that true?
So it's not
For me, this is not about inequality. This is about living standards of the ordinary people of this country. If you give £700 billion to the richest people in the country when the economy is closed, they will spend that money, drive up prices, and ordinary families increasingly will not be able to afford the basics like food and energy. Listen, if you give this money to the rich, it affects ordinary people.
So what is your solution?
A wealth tax, enforced spending. Listen,
But do you not accept that all of the downsides to wealth taxes, the fact that almost everywhere that they've been tried, they've subsequently been
you're
reversed?
talking to somebody...
Well, I would actually go with Ha-Joon Chang, and I would rather go with price caps as well. I mean, wealth tax is true, but price caps too.
Who has made millions of pounds by betting that the economy will collapse every single year, okay? And I'm betting on that right now, and I don't want it to happen. If you do nothing about growing inequality, poverty will get worse and worse and worse. And I'm telling you now, listen...
Yes, Imagination Scene, I reacted to the Loki interview... was it last stream? It'll be if you in my YouTube lives. I did react to the entire Loki interview. Yeah.
In a few years' time, when it happens, when things are worse, remember this date.
It's not
and you can't say you
socially
didn't know about it.
sustainable to run a global economy with this level of inequality. It's not economically sustainable because
Markets work better. Markets work better when they're more equal, right? When people at the bottom rung of the ladder, the actual consumers in our society, have more spending power, have more ability to be able to have discretionary spending, that gives you better market feedback as people have the ability to be able to consume without being constrained by the inelasticity of the market, right? If you want to have a properly productive, a properly innovative capitalistic market framework, you need to have a consumer class who have the ability to choose where they do not spend, right? That's the issue that we have, right? If poor people can only spend on food, housing, energy, and the essentials, they have no ability from that point to be able to go out and spend money on whatever, discretionary spending, consumer electronics, whatever, what have you, that would then drive further production and further innovation to be able to try and capture that market. At the moment in the UK, it's far too unequal, to the point at which no one can consume past the bare essentials because they've all been commodified. These particular things like food, but not food, but things like housing and energy are the demand and the supply-demand curve is so inelastic that it allows these corporations and these companies to price gouge these people because they've been over-marketized. And then they don't have the discretionary income to then be able to go and spend on the actual innovative businesses that should be driving production and innovation in our society. And that's the problem, right? That's the real issue that we have in this country. This is why, amusingly, Norway has more billionaires per capita than any other country in the world, or is one of the top, at least in that particular list, for example. But it's more equal than these countries because they have the ability for them to be the regular people in the country. The welfare state is strong, the unions are strong, and the ability for people to be able to go out and actually spend money in the economy is much higher, right? We have an incredibly stagnant, anemic economy because consumers can't consume, right? And this is why everyone's telling us, oh, well, this issue with demand that we have in the economy. There is no demand. The idea of this demand pull inflation is complete nonsense. There's no demand in this country. People can't spend, right? This is why raising interest rates was stupid. You're right, Hardwood and Sock. I would do panels if anyone invited me, but unfortunately no one invites me anymore, which is sad. You still doing panels? I'm not sure. I've not seen you around, actually. It's been good to see you in chat, though. It's been a while.
There aren't enough consumers with enough money to make the economy work. So it's not fair in any way.
All right.
Nadeem
Look at the facts. We have come through a pandemic when we spent £400 billion. I do not think we should allow our children and our grandchildren to pay that debt. And we've now got a cost of living crisis basically because of the energy crisis. And the government has put billions of pounds into supporting particularly the most vulnerable over the last few months and moving forward. But talking about wealth tax, we should not be creating more tax. We should be cutting.
All right, well, you're very clear on that. We're going to talk about something else which is sort of related.
Yeah,
levelling.
We should be cutting tax for poor people. We should be cutting tax for the lower middle classes, right? We should be cutting tax for the people who actually do the work. We should not be cutting tax for people working in the tech industry and people who make money off of dividends, right? That's the issue. Is that the problem is we have a country where it's far more profitable to sit on your arse owning assets than it is to actually go out and be productive and work and, build the wealth of the civilization. Cheers, Sock. I much appreciated. I appreciate that.
Up. It's the great mantra of Boris Johnson and continues under Rishi Sunak. More than 100 schemes, it's been announced today, have won government funding in the second phase of the Levelling Up Fund. It's worth about £2.1 billion. It's not an insignificant amount of money. Let's give you an idea about how it's going to be spent. Some of it.
He openly boasted about taking money off Labour-held areas and giving them to Tory
He did in a video.
areas.
He said that there are poorer areas in parts of the country that are broadly affluent, but even in the southeast, there are poorer areas that need funding. Is it a good idea? Is this going to transform people's lives in these areas?
Well, I mean, if I take £15 off you and then give you £2.80, is that going to transform your life? These guys, they've found £2.8 billion to give to local councils. In the last 2 years, they've given £700 billion to the rich.
I know you've met
50 times as much. Listen, is it levelling up if I give a poor person £2.80 and I give a rich person £250? No, sorry, £700. 250 times as much. Listen, this government...
That's true, Zero Day Buddy, 100%. Like, it's really expensive to be poor. If you're rich, you can afford to buy one thing one time and have it last you forever. If you're poor, you have to spend more overtime continually replacing the poor value stuff that doesn't last a lot of the time, right? And that's only going to get worse as far more people have to continually consume because unfortunately, a load of the things that we need to continually consume have built-in planned obsolescence, right? For example, you look at the house, like you look at the houses, the council houses that we live in at the moment, right? The council houses that were built in, all of the years, post-war and even pre-war sometimes. Like the house I live in is from the 1930s. There's the council houses that were built in the post-war period are still standing today, still worth loads of money, and still excellent houses to be able to buy and speculate on, because after the right to buy happened, they all got put into the private sector, or a large portion of them did, which means that they became financial assets and are still highly priced financial assets because of the build quality of these houses. Do you get this same build quality from the houses that get built now by the private developers? Of course you don't. Of course you fucking don't. Because they're not being built for human need. They're not being built for utility of people living in them. They're being built to be future speculative assets or future middle-class homeowners, because that's what makes the developers profit. Are they built to last? No, of course they're not built to last, because why would they be built to last when instead of building something that will last for 150 years, you could build something that would last for 50 years, will have to get torn down, and you'll get given the contract by the government to then rebuild it once it collapses. It's nonsensical. Much appreciated, Sock. I really appreciate that. Speculation is the death of society. True. 100%.
Government has presided over the largest and fastest ever increase in inequality in the history of the country. And the most Orwellian thing you've ever heard, they call that levelling up.
What do you say?
It's also worth pointing out as well that the Levelling Up Fund was like a couple of £1 billion. When you compare that to the tens of billions of pounds that's been cut away yearly from council funding because of the austerity cuts during the period of the 2010s, you're essentially taking tens of billions away and giving a couple of billions back. So none of these councils are getting any of the funds that they should have had to be able to regenerate. And the worst part is because of austerity, it would have been cheaper to continually pay for the upkeep of these poorer areas than it would have been, than it is now far more expensive to let them go even further into disrepair.
I'm literally a communist.
Thank you for the follow, Sark, much appreciated. Instead of waiting for them to go into disrepair like they have done right now, and then have to pay even more money to be able to then renovate them rather than actually deal with the upkeep costs that's lower. And we see this time and time and time again in our society, that because of the short-term nature of the incentive structures of neoliberal society, is that loads of things, because they're not running at maximum efficiency, then get caught out when things don't work at maximum efficiency. Look at, for example, during the pandemic, when we looked at the shipping routes coming into this country, they were running at maximum efficiency, and then a pandemic happened, and overnight, all of these trade routes got blocked, right? All of them stopped functioning, because instead of building in contingency into these systems to ensure that they could be able to weather these shocks, they assumed the shocks wouldn't happen and then ran them at maximum efficiency without planning for the rainy day. And we don't do that anywhere in society. It's at least not under neoliberalism, right? We continually let plenty of different things like this continue to get into disrepair because we only think in the short term. And that's obviously, a lot of this is a problem with party political policy. Because why would you put in the investment into something where the dividend will be paid out when the next government is in power? It's all short-termism, and that's a real blight upon our society at the moment. It's why after 13 years of government, the Conservatives have never invested in the absolute stack of white papers they've got for positive cost-benefit analysis infrastructure investments in this country. Because why would they do it when the benefit's going to happen when they're not in power anymore? The incentives are just fucked. They're completely fucked.
I think in this case, we're talking about relatively trivial amounts of money for projects that often ought to be financed by the private sector.
That's a stupid point that she made. Again, it's having these things being continually siphoned off public money into the private sector that's led to the position that we're in at the moment. Just neoliberalisming harder. It's not going to work, Ms. Person from the IEA.
But finally, local authority budgets have been cut. I mean, Angela
Yeah,
is
that's
right. Over the
ridiculous.
years, they have been cut. Have you had complaints from Conservative colleagues who haven't got money after being asked to promote this levelling up?
I haven't spoken to anybody about it either way.
Right, so no one's come to you and
Not me,
complained.
no.
All right, well, let's move on. Let's talk about something completely different. Annabelle, you have a new report out from the Institute of Economic Affairs to do with lab-grown meat. Tell us about it.
Sure. I think the first thing to say is that although this sounds like something in the realm of science fiction, it is underway, but is nonetheless very much in the early days. So
that is surely more friendly for the environment than it is carting it across the world.
All right, well, let me ask our other guest. What do you think about deregulating lab-grown meat? Would you eat a lab-grown burger?
I'll give it a go, I don't mind. My main thought is, you know, I think it's very interesting that the IEA, the Institute of Economic Affairs, has a chance to come on a show like this and talk about a disaster in the economy that partially they caused by inspiring Liz Truss's economic policies, which were a disaster. And instead of grabbing the bull by the horns and talking about this disaster, which is damaging tens of millions of people's lives, they ask us to talk about lab-grown meat.
And what do you think about it?
About lab-grown meat or about the IEA?
Well, you've done the IEA about
lab-grown.
You're not a fan of either.
I mean, it's true. Like, and literally, it's the same reason why Adam Smith Institute will produce nonsense papers about privatising the moon. Because it's all about throwing the dead cats onto the table, right? So that we forget that these people from the IEA crashed the economy.
Technical solutions, are they not to be considered properly when we're looking at things like climate change and the environment?
Yeah, for sure. If they work, if they're just.
But how will you know if they work unless you try them?
Well, I think you should give them a go. But if you're just using them to distract from your own disastrous economic advice, then I think it's probably not a good idea.
That's all for today.
And that's exactly what I was saying during the previous lecture as well, and that we forget that a lot of the things that we have to deal with the climate crisis are already there. They just require governments to actually care, to want to front the capital, and to leave their ideas behind that the free market can fix everything. Because we've seen from multiple segments today, the free market cannot and will not fix everything. Which is probably the thesis of my entire channel at this point, to be honest. And if you're enjoying the content, please do consider liking and subscribing and leaving a comment down below. It always helps the video in the algorithm.